Parenting Beyond Pink and Blue. How to Raise Your Kids Free of Gender Stereotypes. By Christina Pierce Brown. Read by LiBriganti Audiolibri. Music from Zero. Copyright free music. Chapter 3. Why we focus on gender differences. I am frequently asked what I do for work. You know, the standard airplane, cocktail party, just met your new neighbor's small talk opening line. I usually say professor, having learned that saying psychologist always results in a joke about whether I need a case study. But these conversations inevitably lead me to explain that I study gender stereotypes. This is usually followed by my new pal saying something like, "But boys and girls really are different." Of course we treat boys and girls differently, I roll. It's just pointing out the obvious. It's unavoidable. This may be true, but for different reasons that you may think. Maybe we will always point out label and characterize by gender. Maybe everything I've described so far in this book is inevitable and unavoidable. But that isn't necessarily because boys and girls are so different from one another. More likely, we cling on this obsession with gender because we love to categorize people regardless of the criteria. Why do we label and sort by gender all the time? We like to think we have this focus because it's an important biological grouping that tells us a lot about people. For example, knowing that my friend has a daughter, I assume I'll have a leg up in picking out a toy she would like at Toys R Us. But in reality, we sort on the basis of anything if given the chance. In this chapter, I describe the research showing that we are born to categorize people, no matter what the group. As you will see, we are pretty lazy thinkers when it comes to people. And categories make it easy to be lazy. The cost of this laziness is that we make a lot of errors in how we think about people, and it's unfortunate when the errors affect our kids. We are born sorters. We have a couple of fundamental abilities from birth. Unless something goes really wrong in development, all babies around the world, regardless of whether they grow up in a Manhattan high-rise or an African village, quickly learn how to categorize. With little input from adults and only a small bit of exposure, babies can categorize all sorts of stuff. Babies come out of the womb inundated with perceptual information, different sights, sound, textures, movements. They innately begin looking for correlations among all the information, seemingly designed from birth to figure out how the details go together. Take two animals, dogs and bears. Infants quickly learn these are two different categories, even though there are similarities between them. Both have fur, 4 legs, mouths, eyes, and ears. But the smaller animals always bark, and the larger animals always roar. Babies can pick up on these correlations between size and sound and learn that the animals belong to two different groups. Babies can learn categories like these long before they can talk, even before they can sit up. Grace's preschool friends amazed me the other day. They were correctly naming very abstract pictures of animals in watercolor painting. They were able to detect the shape of a trunk and know it was an elephant and could detect the stripes of a tiger. They knew enough about some characteristics to figure out the category, even when major details, like the actual bodies, were missing. This ability to form categories, whether of animals, cars, or food, is important for babies. It helps them navigate a really complicated world early on. The quicker a baby can group information, the quicker that baby can get what it needs or move on to learning about the next thing. The quicker babies learn that apple, pears, and plums are all sweet fruits that they enjoy and that tomatoes don't belong to that group, the happier they are. Poor Grace has struggled with this one. We eat a lot of grape tomatoes in our salads and she enthusiastically eats one every time, shouting, "Great!" She loves grapes and eats them by handful. Every time, though, she spits out the tomato in disgust, she has traumatized herself. At least based on her overly dramatic reaction, because those tomatoes pretend to be in one category but they really belong to another one. It rocks the world every week. But her shocked reaction to this one exception shows how good we usually are at forming categories and how we are usually right. This is one of our most adaptive qualities for surviving as humans. Nothing is as fun as a face. Our second fundamental ability humans are born with, in addition to forming categories, is the universal capacity to pay attention to and learn about faces. Within hours, as soon as the nurse wipes the gunk off your baby's eyes, he or she shows a preference for face over anything and everything else. Of all the innate tendencies we have as humans, zeroing in on people is a really important one. People are the ones most likely to feed us and protect us from danger. It always pays off to pay attention to the gravy train. And those pregnancy pains were worth it. Because within the first week, newborns prefers mom's face to stranger's face. It is a complex mix of familiarity, early love, and recognizing their meal ticket. A side note on research with babies. Most research has focused on moms instead of dads, as moms have historically been what researchers call the primary caregiver. Times are definitely changing, and many dads are raising babies by themselves or with another dad. But the number of those dads is still relatively small, and researchers are slow to catch up. The result is that we know a lot more about how babies look at moms than at dads. Even among babies with a mom and a dad at home, the majority of babies spend most of their early days with moms, especially if they're nursing. Babies are adept at learning about faces. Before they can roll over around 3 months old, they can distinguish other people's faces, especially those of women who are the same race as their mom, because this is the person category they see the most frequently. Even with short divisions, they are already becoming experts about their most familiar category. By 6 months old, babies recognize that women's faces and men's faces belong to two different categories. When researchers show babies a series of pictures of women, babies are interested and stare intently at the pictures. But when the researchers keep showing one picture after another of many different women, babies eventually become bored. It is as though they said, "We get it, women, move on." They finally turn away, uninterested by the repetition of the same category. If the researchers then show the 6-month-old babies a picture of a man, they become interested again. They recognize that the researchers have finally showed them something new. They now start looking at the pictures again, recognizing that the new pictures belong to a new category. They need some help, though, to see these two categories of people. We aren't born knowing men from women. To help babies recognize that men and women are different, they need the hair cues. Women with short hair can throw them off. And they need delicate features for women and strong jaws for men. Everyone needs to be a classic stereotype of their category. Men are actually pretty tricky to sort. Their characteristics differ a lot from each other. Ryan Gosling with his more delicate features and Russell Crowe with his square jaw and scruffy beard have drastically different characteristics, and it is difficult for babies to pick up on the common details of men to put them into one group. In other words, when there is a lot of variability in people who belong to one group, babies have a harder time forming the category. Over the next year, babies get better at sorting people into gender groups. By their first birthday, babies can match female voices to female faces and male voices to male faces. They actually look longer at the face that matches the gender of the voice they are hearing. They pick up on the link that all those people with long hair also have high-pitched voices. By 16 months, babies can label the gender of their parents. Then they are off the races. Labeling categories helps sorting, and by 2 years old, kids are experts. We don't just sort by gender, though. We are born with these two strong drives, to categorize everything and to focus on people. It is only logical that we are going to use our sorting powers on our favorite subject, people. And sort them we do, regardless of the grouping. Latching onto any group. When Herz Mordechai was born in Jewish parents in Poland in 1919, his future was pretty uncertain. At the time, anti-Semitism was rampant and Polish Jews were not allowed to have much of an education. When it was time for advanced studies, Mordechai left Poland and traveled to France to study chemistry at Sorbonne. Not long after, as Second World War II began, he left his studies to help the French army fighter Hitler. A year later, he was captured by the Germans and held as a prisoner of war. Mordre, who now called himself Henry Tafel, knew the importance of belonging to the right group. He admitted to his German captors that he was Jewish, but claimed to be a French citizen, knowing that a Polish Jew would certainly be executed. When he was finally released from captivity, he discovered that his entire family and most of his friends in Poland had died of Holocaust. He was overwhelmed with the realization that so many German, seemingly normal and decent people, he had developed such a hatred of Jewish that they had been complicit in their deaths. With this realization, he was no longer interested in chemistry. Instead, he embarked on a career in psychology to better understand why and how one group of people could form such hostility toward another group of people. What he discovered was that it doesn't take much. Tafel, who went to become a social psychologist at Bristol University in England, pioneered what he came to be known as the minimal group experiment. He found that simply putting people into a group, regardless of whether the group was meaningful or not, led to stereotyping and prejudice. In one of his now classic studies, he showed research participants two paintings, one by Paul Klee and one by Wassily Kandinsky, and asked them which they preferred. Regardless of their answer, he told them he was assigning them to a group with other people who had the same tastes. Sometimes he labeled the newly formed groups as the Klee group and the Kandinsky group, and sometimes he never gave the group label. When people thought they belonged to the Klee group, they thought the group was best. Likewise, people who belonged to the group labeled Kandinsky group thought their group was the best. However, if the researchers didn't label these groups, people didn't really care and liked both groups just the same. Tafel took it a step further, though. He randomly divided some new research participants into an X group and W group. He simply tossed a coin, and the participants knew they were assigned to a group based on a coin toss. Again, as in the Klee and Kandinsky study, he sometimes labeled the group X or W, and sometimes he didn't. He found that even when the groups were random, even the people in the groups were random and based on a coin toss, they were biased toward their group when their group was labeled. Thousands of studies have since reaffirmed that people almost always do this when put into groups. Psychologists have gotten research participants to form stereotypes on the basis of whether they are wearing a red or a blue shirt, whether they are assigned to one summer camp cabin or another, and even whether they think they overestimate or underestimate the number of dots on a chalkboard. Simply putting people into groups, even totally meaningless groups based on coin tosses, leads them to latch on these groups and form attitudes related to the groups. This doesn't just happen in a research lab. In real life, we also do this with any kind of group. I'm a professor at the University of Kentucky, a school with an excellent basketball team. My students get riled up when asked what they think of Duke, another basketball powerhouse, or ask Yankees fans what they think of the Red Sox. There is a rivalry between cops and firefighters in many cities. Popular t-shirt proclaim, "If you can take the heat, become a cop," or "If you can't walk the beat, become a firefighter," or ask Twilight fans whether they are Team Edward or Team Jacob. The groups we like to latch onto can be more meaningful than who shoots a ball best. I would say, ask African Americans what they think of whites and whites what they think of African Americans, but we have learned to hide our true feelings when it comes to race. When we measure people's attitudes without them knowing it, by measuring their implicit attitudes, we see that these groups are just as meaningful as ever, with each group liking their own group best. Think racial stereotypes are long gone? Google racist jokes on Obama. They're not gone by long shot. Want to see some hardcore ramification of the group we latch onto? Ask Israelis what they think of Palestinians and vice versa. These groups are just as important for children as for adults. Daniel Bartol, a Jewish Israeli psychologist at Tel Aviv University, reports researchers showing that the vast majority of Israeli children in elementary school associated Palestinian with violent acts such as kidnapping, murder, terrorism, and criminality. These attitudes aren't based on children's actual experience and exist even if children live in areas with no nearby conflicts. When children are shown a picture of a person who could be either Jewish or Arab, simply based on whether his name fits one group or the other, children describe the man as either friendly or mean. Same man, same expression, only the group has changed. Obviously, the Israeli and Palestinian conflict is much more complicated than the Yankees versus Red Sox rivalry, but the human tendency to sort, categorize, and judge on the basis of those categories drives it all, and is present from birth. We love a category. We likely have a biological tendency to use categories and form stereotypes based on those categories. After all, the world is highly complex. We encounter people and have new experiences every minute. Even a boring day is full of new sights and sounds, if you pay attention. As humans, we have evolved and adapted to sort and categorize all we encounter in this complex world. That skill has served us well. It's helpful to know that bears are dangerous. I don't need to evaluate the individual characteristic of the bear. I can lump them into one group and quickly get the hell out of the forest. In our evolutionary past, it was likely beneficial to know which group a person belonged to as a quick way to distinguish friends from enemies. It made adaptive sense to make these quick decisions. Our modern world is more highly complex than ever. Walking into Toys R Us would make our ancestors flee in fear. Being able to divide Toys R Us in half and only shop the girl half or the toy half makes life much quicker and easier. The Toys R Us flagship store in Times Square is 110,000 square feet of chaos. If I can shave an hour off my shopping trip, I'm more likely to survive. More than anything else, though, we are lazy. Maybe lazy with good reasons, but lazy nonetheless. Susan Fiske and Shelley Taylor wrote an influential book about social cognition based on their work as social psychologists at Harvard. In it, they coined a term that has stuck because it explains a lot of human behavior. Just as Ebenezer Scrooge wouldn't spend a penny unless he had to, we don't spend any mental energy unless absolutely necessary. Instead, individuals rely on simple and efficient ways of processing new information and making judgments. It takes too much mental effort to fully evaluate every new piece of information that comes our way. If we did, we'd have information overload. Imagine the new parent who stumbles into the bottle section at a baby superstore and is trying to pick out the best type of bottle. One reduces colic, one has the safest plastic, one is dishwasher safe, one is latex free, one best mimics mom. All of these competing informations leads to paralysis. A person could stand in the aisle for hours reading labels. Instead, we have to quickly categorize things and move on. We don't have time to be rational and objectively think about every possible detail. We would be paralyzed by every new situation. It is much more efficient for this parent to think, "Oh, this label looks familiar, the commercial was just on. I will just get this one." The categories in our minds are well established. We have been creating them since birth, so it doesn't take much mental energy to store new information. It also means we don't pay much attention to new information. We force it into a bin whether it fits perfectly or not. Our minds work like a well-organized playroom. There are bins for everything: cars, puzzles, crayons, farm animals. It took a long time to get it organized, but once everything has a container, it is easy to keep it clean. Even young kids can learn to quickly put away their toys in the right bin. They find a card between couch cushions, quick toss it into the card box, find some random crayons lying around. The kids know where they go. Without this sorting system, the place would stay a cluttered mess. Okay, if you can actually get your kids to do this, please give me a call and tell me how. But the metaphor works. We have categories in our mind that help us organize and process our worlds. We use those categories because it's an easier and more efficient way to navigate life than to attend to every individual characteristic. In our everyday lives, it is often useful to be cognitive misers. It is helpful to have quick organized categories to use in a pinch. My own daily experience as a mom highlights this usefulness, even though I work incredibly hard to fight the categories. For example, in any given school year, Maya is invited to up to 10 birthday parties. I only vaguely know most of these kids. I may recognize them from school, but I definitely don't know what kind of toys they might like. So party time comes, and we need a last-minute gift. If I can run into the store and pick up something quickly between piano lessons and the softball game, it makes my life easier. That is my modern version of a quick decision. Instead of paying attention to the individual characteristics of the birthday child, my human overwhelmed brain quickly goes to what I think an average 8-year-old girl might like. 5 minutes in and out, present wrapped in the car, and we arrive at the party only 5 minutes later. Trying to be quick and easy often leads to heavily reliance on stereotypes despite our best intentions. Genderschmender. From birth, we gravitate toward grouping people. We form groups and base our attitudes on these groups, even when they are entirely meaningless. This helps us quickly process our complex world, and is part of why humans remain on the top of the food chain. We latch on to gender as an important grouping because it's easy. It helps us reduce the individual messy detail of a given situation. But that really has little to do with gender. In fact, in the next 2 chapters, I describe how there aren't actually that many differences. We don't latch onto gender because it's an important biological distinction. There are lots of those distinctions: short and tall, brown eyes and blue eyes, white and black, and we used to sort by race all the time. We had different schools and different water fountains. That is a grouping based on physical traits that most people deem socially unacceptable. But because we love, and maybe cognitively need, a group to distinguish each other as humans, we use another one: gender. It is less about the biological origin of the group and more about the cognitive ease it provides us. Why is gender so easily used as a category? We make it easy by highlighting it every chance we get. Every pink or blue t-shirt, every taped on bio, every good morning boys and girls, every boys will be boys comment strengthens the category and makes it more accessible. Neuroscience has shown us that the more we hear, see or think about something, the more those neural pathways strengthen, and the easier it is to keep taking that path. When we quickly need to sort the world, gender categories are ready to be pulled out. What happens when we group people? This innate drive to use groups is helpful when we are talking about bears and tomatoes, but when it comes to sorting people, we have a few glitches in the system. We sometimes make errors, like Grace did with those confusing grape tomatoes. Often we make the same type of errors over and over. The errors aren't random either. The errors we make serve an important purpose. Our brains are happiest when everything is consistent. But life is full of dissonance. People acting any which way they want in ways we can't predict. A lesson that every parent learns the hard way in week 1. To have consistency in a world full of dissonance, we do all sorts of mental tricks to make the information that comes inconsistent with what we already think. We like our mental playroom to be nicely organized, but we also don't like to have to reorganize it after we've done it once. When we make the information fit, we are just strengthening those categories more and more over time. We engage in 3 consistent mental tricks in our thinking when we sort people into groups. The first mental trick: exaggerating between group differences. We exaggerate any differences between groups. We want to believe each of our category bins are really different, so we play up the differences between them. Truffle, in another classic study, found that if he drew a series of lines on the board and grouped some lines on one side and labeled them A, and grouped different lines on the other side and labeled them B, then the people in his study perceived the A lines to differ in length from the B lines. The error is that the lines were the exact same length. The same principle works with people. If I see a boy get 92 on his math test and a girl get an 89 on hers, I focus on the differences between them instead of the similarities. I report that he got an A and she got B instead of saying their scores only differed by 3 points. The second mental trick: exaggerating within group similarities. We exaggerate the similarities of members within another group. For example, you may have heard some variation of this phrase in reference to racial groups. They all look alike. It is hard to see that this is just an optical illusion, but it is, and everyone, regardless of his or her racial group, makes the same error. We aren't born with this mental trick. It develops with time and experience. For example, at 3 months old, white infants can distinguish the individual faces of people from lots of different races: white, Middle Eastern, Asian, African American. When they are 6 months old, they are getting better at forming groups based on race. but they can only distinguish individual people if they are white or Asian. By the time white babies approach 9 months old, they can only see the differences among individual white faces. Everyone else looks the same. We do the same thing with other categories. When they are shown a lot of faces of cute little monkeys, baby at only 6 months old can remember the individual faces they have seen before and can distinguish between individual monkeys. 3 months later, the monkeys all look alike to the babies. I have taken this test myself. It is true. All the monkeys look alike to me. Here is a situation in which the infant outsmarts the adult. Even though we start out as small babies who can see the differences between people or monkeys within a given group that is not our own, the similarities we perceive later override any differences we originally could see. Because we make our group so distinct, so front and center, we are primed to think that girls are really similar to each other, boys are really similar to each other, and boys and girls are really different from one another. So, I am much more likely to rush into the Toys R Us for a birthday gift assuming Maya's female friends will like whatever Maya likes, because I'm also assuming most girls are similar to my own daughter while her male friends will not like whatever she likes, because most boys are different from my daughter. It is the exact same premise behind thinking that A and B lines differ in the example above. This kind of thinking helps me be consistent and not worry about the pesky little details that come along with individuals. The third mental trick: remembering stereotypes, consistent information. We only pay attention to and remember the information that fits our way of thinking. If you think everyone is the same, then you overlook any differences. On Grace's first day of her new preschool, she clung to my leg and tentatively surveyed her surroundings. Meanwhile, a very loud and outgoing boy roared around the room. The teacher matter-of-factly stated, "Boys just bound into the room exploring, while girls are more timid and take their time." This was meant to be reassuring, but this was a tiny problem. It wasn't true. The only other boy at preschool that morning was outside the door, crying with his mom, refusing to even approach the classroom. His crying could be heard where we stood, but the teacher had overlooked the piece of evidence that didn't fit her way of thinking. Hundreds of studies have shown that we are good at forgetting the exceptions to the rule. In one example, researchers read stories to study participants in which either a female or a male student lost a math contest. Overwhelmingly, participants forgot the details in the story that didn't fit their gender stereotype and added details that strengthened their preconceived notions. For example, 89% of the people in the study forgot that the male math student cried, and 83% forgot that the female student beat a pillow in frustration. Plus, half of the study participants completely made up new information to fit their stereotype, falsely remembering the female as pouting and complaining and the male as playing violent video games. Fighting the laziness. The mental tricks people play to keep their grouping intact affect our kids. This is extremely important to parents of a child who is different from the norm in any little way. And the reality is that most kids are. For example, a teacher may be unsure of how to soothe a sensitive boy who is crying if he or she don't recognize the sensitivity and heightened emotions are a normal male trait. Your kid's unique qualities may be overlooked or simplified. If the teacher assumes that Grace is timid, proper girl, she won't be prepared when Grace's true bold and fearless nature comes out 10 minutes after arrival at school. A teacher who quickly pegs her as a typical girl won't be prepared for the very small child scaling to 10-foot-high jungle gym. What is a parent to do? Sometimes I try to delicately point out the differences between girls. I responded to Grace's teacher by saying, "Well, my oldest daughter would attack a room right away. She walks up to everyone like she knows them." I also try to emphasize the way in which my own daughter don't fit the stereotype while highlighting their unique qualities. I want the teacher to be aware that Grace is fearless once she's comfortable, and help maximize Grace's strength instead of overlooking it. If I had a sensitive boy, I would tell the teacher how he likes to be soothed. This becomes even more important as kids age, especially if you have a computer whiz daughter or a poetry writing son. I try to remember that we are all cognitive misers. finding it much easier to assume all girls are more timid than boys, and overlooking exceptions that challenge our rule. But the trouble is that the three mental tricks we use are flawed. The exceptions to our rules are actually kids who don't fit neatly into categories. When we ignore how they differ from others, we also ignore their unique qualities and strengths. It is easier to lump markers, pencils, and crayons into the same playroom bin than to have separate bins for each. But if we keep doing that over and over, our bins lose their usefulness. They don't help us find things. We will see in the next chapter that categorizing by gender has lost most of its usefulness. It blocks us from predicting our kids' strengths and vulnerabilities, or maximizing their potential. The reality is that kids are complicated. Far too complicated and distinct to be sorted into only one of two bins. The final four. What are the key issues? Practically from birth, we have the capacity to put anything into categories, and our favorite thing to sort is people. Categorizing helps us conserve mental energy in a really complicated world. We are lazy thinkers, but quick categorization has helped us to stay at the top of the food chain. We form categories and stereotypes on the basis of anything, even when grouping are totally random. Don't believe me? Ask football fans what they think of their biggest rivals. We have such strong stereotypes about gender because it's an easy grouping to latch onto. It has nothing to do with gender per se. We are just looking for a straightforward way to simplify the world. We make gender grouping easy to do by frequently highlighting gender with every blue stroller or taped-on hair bow or pretty girl, strong boy comment. Because of how we conserve mental energy, we think people in different groups are more different from each other than they really are. And we ignore or forget any exceptions to our rules. So, when we assume girls are really similar to one another and very different from boys, it is just an illusion.